This is a citywide change to the zoning code requested by Councilmember Gray and supported by many of his colleagues in the city council for the purpose of amending bulk and yard requirements in the various residential zoning districts. And just a quick highlight for folks who may have not seen proposed amendments before, if something is in brackets in the chat or in the text that we're going to see shortly, it has been removed or proposed to be removed. And if something is in all caps, it's proposed to be new. And there are two examples there if you want to quickly read through them. And then we will jump into the language of the amendments. You'll also see a little flag in the corner. If there are no changes proposed to this portion of the zoning tables, it'll say in the corner, same as current, and we'll flag it in that kind of pale minty green. And then if we jump to the next page where there are proposed changes, we've highlighted them and outlined them in red, and then the little corner flag is red and it says amended. Here in the low density residential districts, the proposed change to maximum lot coverage, so this is just for the main structures, not for anything else, is increased by 10% across the board. So what was formerly 25% jumps to 35%, all the way up from 35 jumping to 45 in our R4 districts. Then the interior side yards in every district are requested to be reduced by 5 feet. So 20 reduces to 15, 15 to 10, 10 to 5. And there are no 0-foot interior side yard. So this is any side yard you share with a neighbor, there's still a requirement to have something there. And then there is a change to the corner side yard. So this is obviously the corner lot on a street. There's a typo in there that's just a clerical error that we flagged for correction. And there's another one on a successive slide. Then there are also footnotes that apply to this entire table. None of the footnotes for table 8-401, which is low density residential, are proposed to change. Now we're jumping into medium and high density residential in our row home districts. Right now, there's no proposed change to the minimum lot area for any of these uses, community managed open space gardens or farms, same for detached and semi-detached dwellings. Where the changes come into play here are a proposed reduction in the required square footage on a piece of property for multifamily dwellings in R5, 6, 7, and 8. This is not a requirement for a specific size of unit, but it's a requirement for how much land area you have to add an additional unit. So in R5, it's being reduced by 1,000 square feet. In R6, it's being reduced by 500 square feet. In R7, it's being reduced by 350 square feet. And in R8, it's being reduced by 250 square feet per unit. The language for residential care facilities and age-restricted residential care facilities in these districts are not changing, so it will still apply to similar multifamily dwellings. So even though this language is not changing, if we jump back one slide, we can see that these changes will somewhat impact any of those similar types of uses, so they'll still have the same minimum lot area required. And then there are no changes proposed for the required area for rooming houses, urban agriculture, or any other permitted use in the district. There are no changes on here to the proposed maximum building height, but one thing we do want to note is some of the language in the footnotes that we'll see shortly is proposed to change. Obviously, we'll discuss that as it comes out. Then for maximum lot coverage for row houses and multifamily, the proposal is to increase that by 10% in R5, 15% in R6, 20% in R7, and increase by 20% for row houses in R8. And then also the language of that proposed, of the footnote that this applies to, does also have some minor changes there. There's no proposed change to the maximum impervious surface, and we'll get to a little explainer about that. And the lot coverage is with the building and any additional structures on the property cover, and then the impervious surface regulates what's left over after you put a property on, after you put a building or structure on there. typical lot, you're allowed by right currently 60% coverage of 100% of your lot, but then the rear yard is just a subsection, and the impervious surface requirement applies just to any of the required yards. So even though it says 65%, it's not 65% of the lot, it's 65% of 40% of the lot. And then the proposed change would bump up the allowable coverage by right to 80% in some cases. Your rear yard is still 100% of your rear yard. However, the impervious surface area required is not changing. It's just going to be a smaller percentage. So instead of 65% of 40%, it's 65% of 20%, which when you add all the numbers together or multiply them as you will, the proposed change would reduce the required green area to be left over by 7%, not a whole 20% as you would look if you just subtracted 80 from 60 and vice versa. And that's just because the way Baltimore City currently calculates impervious surface and property coverage under the zoning code, the house is considered separate. For stormwater regulations, that's calculated a little differently, but just for the zoning and how much of your property you can cover, this is how we regulate it currently. Now we'll jump into the minimum front yards for any of these districts. For the medium and high density residential, no proposed changes there. And then same for the front yards for multifamily dwellings and other uses in these districts. One note is the minimum interior side yard is proposed to be reduced by 5 feet across the board in all of these districts, and that is for detached dwellings, semi-detached dwellings, and multifamily dwellings. And you'll also note there's a footnote 8 there that does have some new language, as footnote 8 is completely new in this. And then regulations on the corner side yard, generally reducing it by 10 feet anywhere it's applicable. There are some places, as you can see, where there's no corner side yard required, and we're not changing that. Then for row houses and multifamily in R8 districts, the proposed change is to reduce the required minimum rear yard by 8 feet for row houses and 13 feet for multifamily dwellings. And then we'll jump into the footnote changes. Footnote 1, which referred to the height, permissible height of certain structures, what is, as currently written, is a conditional use to go up to a maximum of 45 feet for a building. The proposed language here removes the conditional use and would just become permissible through staff review as opposed to review by the Board of Municipal and Zoning Appeals. Then for footnote 4, it's just clarifying the standard where 80% coverage applies versus 100% coverage. And then footnotes 8 and 9 are both new for a multifamily dwelling that's attached to another structure. So a semi-detached structure, it's clarifying where the interior side yard standard applies. Obviously it doesn't apply to the part that's hooked up to another building. And then footnote 9 clarifying that if 100% lot coverage is allowed, there's not going to be a conflicting standard that also requires a rear yard, so you couldn't really cover 100%. This clarifies that you could. In general, this proposal is slated to align with general historic trends in the Board of Municipal and Zoning Appeals process. We've seen a lot of folks who try and come in and are looking to just increase their lot coverage by a certain amount to bring it up to modern living standards, modern expectations for what folks want to see in the market. And the threshold to get an approval by the Board of Municipal and Zoning Appeals requires developers and homeowners to show a practical difficulty. So if there is a reason why you couldn't follow our rules that wasn't created by the property owner, then that's the standard that's required. The proposed language in this amendment raises the bar before you have to come there. So it means that you're going to have to show an even greater practical difficulty before it's realistic that a board would grant any variances over and above the new higher threshold. And then the two main interpretations, I apologize, it looks like some of the formatting here bumped over, but on the housing access side, this proposal would allow for more effective reuse and redevelopment of existing structures as well as vacant lots. It also gives you greater flexibility on what you can do on a property before you have to come and get extra approval. That takes time, money, and resources. It allows for higher land utilization, so we can service more people with less infrastructure, which is a great goal to have, and it can help developers and current homeowners follow more modern expectations for housing size as families grow or as new developments come in. On the flip side, this would be a necessary trade-off between green area and development. This is something that every city wraps their head around, and it's just a trade-off how it's applied. And what this would do would reduce the green area required on individual properties by 7%, as we discussed on the map outline. This is most impactful in R7 and R8 districts, where the allowable lot coverage is higher and the required rear yard is smaller, which, if you've ever been in a small row house, sometimes it's really nice to have a little patch of green, but if it's not required for new projects, then it may not be provided. It's something that's nice to have, but it may reduce the desirability for folks who are coming in and looking to move to Baltimore, and it also reduces the net ability to manage stormwater through very passive means. One thing I do want to clarify, during the presentation last time, we were talking about stormwater management. Most individual single-family dwellings are exempt from stormwater management standards if they're just a standalone single-family house. But if it's part of a larger development, then our other stormwater management standards apply. And the comparison for what we would be giving up and gaining in buildable area versus green space, this would be a total of up to, but no more than, about 13.8 million buildable square feet in R7 districts. However, that's distributed across something like 8 or 10% of the land area of the city. So realistically, it's only a couple hundred extra square feet per property, which can be the difference for certain species of plants to survive, but could also mean the difference between making your money back on a development and not. And then a gain of about 36 million buildable square feet in R8 with that same caveat. And then even though you'd be losing the about 14 million buildable square feet, gaining the 14 million buildable square feet, you would lose about 5 million square feet of green space in R7 districts and about 12.5 million in R8. Once again, distributed across multiple properties, something more like dozens of square feet that you'd be missing out on. In general, like we mentioned, it's just a trade-off between what we want to be able to build versus what we want to see unbuilt and maintained in more of a natural form. And it's something that, if approved, mainly impacts the areas which historically lack robust communal green space infrastructure, and instead sometimes only green space in the areas what you've got in your backyard.